Hello, guys, and welcome to Ruben's History Show. So today I am going to talk about the construction project all over the Soviet Union that started in the late 1950s. It was known as the Khrushchev's project, or in Russian it would be Khrushchevsky, which was to build million of apartment buildings all over the USSR, and so there were a lot of apartment buildings built in the USSR during the Khrushchev rule, short after World War II ended in 1945. So that when so after it was the end of World War II, that was when the Cold War began in 1948. Shortly 3 years after the World War II ended in 1945, and so after the death of Stalin in 1953, Soviet people were living very poorly, and the economy was not doing very well under the Khrushchev era. After Khrushchev was removed from power, it was Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev time, the Soviet economy was doing very well. But at the end of his rule, the economy was doing very bad because he invaded Afghanistan in the year 1979. And so, in the late 1950s, by 1957, 1958, or 59, the Soviet Union began a construction program all over Soviet Union or the USSR, in which the Soviet Union built this apartment building so they could improve the working conditions of the Soviet workers if they were going to their factories or their other workplaces they were going at. Because if you remember, by the end of World War II, a lot of Soviet cities were destroyed by the Germans. That while the Germans were in the Soviet Union fighting against the Russians, and while the Nazis were in the USSR at the time. And so a lot of villages, a lot of cities were destroyed, like, for example, at the Stalingrad and Leningrad, and a bunch of other cities in the Soviet Union, and a lot of towns in that country were destroyed by the Germans, by the Nazis, the fascist invaders, the Nazis. And so that's one of the reasons why Khrushchev started the construction project. And so the Soviet Union built over 1 million apartment buildings in Soviet Union, so Soviet families could live in the apartment buildings during the Khrushchev era, while Khrushchev was leader of Soviet Union. So that was after he took power in USSR in 1953. So that was just years before before that program begun in the USSR at the time. And so that took place all under the rule of Nikita Khrushchev. It took place, and then the project all ended in the early 60s. It was between probably 1960 or 1964 when Khrushchev was removed from power as leader of Soviet Union by top government officials in Soviet Union. So the project lasted from the late 1950s all the way to the early 1960s. And so his and so they got the name Hrushchevsky, which was Khrushchev's last name, and they made his and they made the project, the construction program, Hrushchevsky project. And so and then they built apartment buildings so they could live in the apartment buildings. And so they had elevators in that country, and they also had staircases to go. Like, if, for example, if you were walking to that section where you live, like if you had to go on the third, fourth, or whatever floor, you could just take the elevator, or you could go on the stairs during that period, while Soviet Union was still around. And then also under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev was when the time he became leader of Soviet Union shortly after Khrushchev was removed from power, and by and so during the Brezhnev era, when Brezhnev was leader of Soviet Union, he promised the Soviet people or Soviet family, each family would get a separate bedroom. So the one person would have the bedroom, and so one person would have the bedroom, and they would also get one extra room during that period. And then also a lot of people also live in Hrushchevsky even to this very day still. They live in some apartment buildings that Khrushchev constructed while he was leader of the USSR during that period from 1953 to 1964, while he was still the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union during that period. And then also he also wanted to bring. He also said in 20 years, what he gave a speech. It was in 1961, I believe it was, and he said by 1981, 20 years later, or 2 decades later, which is not far away from 1961 to 1968. So he said, in 20 years, Soviet Union will be communism, but it already was communism. But at that time, they said it was socialism at that period. So, but then it was all communism in Soviet Union at the time. But then also Soviet Union had a socialist system during that period, and that was also a famous Khrushchev slogan that he said while he gave the speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1961. At that period. So, and then he also said at the speech that the generation of the Soviet people will live under communism, but then the Soviet people said that Soviet Union is not communism, it is socialism. But in reality, it was communism because it was a communist government, Soviet Union was. And everything was owned by everyone in the country. And so also in the Slotki Piaram, which is a 1975 movie, it was based on this New Year's movie. It was in the Soviet Union, and it took place on the new year of January 1st, 1976. So a year right after 1975 ended. So and then it also featured bathrooms in the Khrushchevsky apartments in that country. And then it was and then in the Slotki Piaram, which is a Soviet Russian comedy Christmas or New Year's movie, was released in 1975, 1978, 1976, in which this one person got drunk, and his friend accidentally put him on the plane, and so they sent him to the same address, but he was from Moscow, but then they sent him into Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg today, and they put him on a train a plane to St. Petersburg, and he was in the same address, but it was a different house. It was a different person was living in that house at that period. And then he was in the house for some time, and then he went back to Moscow with his girlfriend, I believe it was. So I hope you enjoyed this very interesting video. So please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in more videos in the future.